I too wanted to thank the incredible speakers that we've had earlier, Eric, Terrence, Torrance, and Elijah. It reminds me of a visualization exercise that someone had uh, taken me through a while back. And that exercise is to imagine yourself holding a cup of coffee and you're waiting to pay, and then somebody bumps you and you spill the coffee. And and you ask yourself, well, someone says, well, what happened? Why did you spill the coffee? And the immediate response is, well, somebody bumped me. But the other way one can look at it is, it's because I had coffee in my cup. If I'd had tea in my cup, I would have spilled tea. If there was water in the cup, I would have spilled water. And life's kind of like that. We all have bumps along the way. There's stuff that shakes us up along the way. And we have to reflect what we have in our cup. And the young men that I've heard speak today, their cups are filled with joy and determination and hope and love. And I think it's a real lesson for all of us to reflect what we all carry in our cups. Because we want, on those periods of life where we get jostled or we spill something, we want to be spilling love and compassion. And we don't want to be spilling negative energy. So thank you all very much for that. So we're going to talk a bit about clinical trials, things that I will walk the young men that I care for and their families through when they're thinking about a clinical trial, and things I'd encourage you to sort of make a little mental note of, that you could talk to the neuromuscular provider that cares for you if you're thinking about a clinical trial. And then we'll talk about the registry as well, because it's critically important, and I'll explain why in just a bit. So I do have some disclosures of some advice that I've provided to various sponsors. I've been a site principal investigator for over 20 regulated clinical trials for DMD and then other neuromuscular conditions. And I'm the pediatric lead of the Canadian Neuromuscular Disease Registry. We're going to talk a bit about, again, what happens before clinical trials even come onto our radar, a lot of the preclinical work. We'll talk about what you need to ask about when considering it. And then reflecting on whether the specific clinical trial that you're considering is in fact the right one for you or for your child. To ask questions like, what are my alternatives? And then we'll end with what is this Duchenne registry and why is it important? So there's a lot of work happens before we even really hear about these clinical trials. And the Stellos group was talking about how Dr. Rudnicki had been working on that area of trying to improve satellite cell regeneration for over 10 years. So that speaks to how much stuff can go on before it actually moves into the clinical trial domain. And I'm sure all the other companies, all the other sponsors will have similar stories of the tremendous work that needs to be done at the microscope, in the lab in theory, and then with animal modeling before the clinical trials begin. Some of that very early research, that very early basic science will ask questions like, what if I give this medication to a fruit fly or to a zebrafish? Can we actually fit this gene or part of this gene into a viral vector? Is it even possible to do that? Can we fit an antisense, or can we get an antisense oligonucleotide, these exon skipping therapies? Can we even get them into muscle? So these are the sorts of things, working with cell lines, working with very, very primitive animals that tell us, yeah, this is something that looks like it's worth going forward, or no, it doesn't seem like it's something that's feasible. And then we move into some of the preclinical studies, and all medications that are studied in clinical trials have been studied in animals. All of them have. And some of the questions that I ask myself when I'm trying to make a decision about whether this is a clinical trial and a product that I think is in my patient's best interests, one that I want to bring forward and give people an opportunity to be part of, is what benefit has this medication shown in those animals that have been administered that study medication? What types of animals have been treated with that study medication? Because I think we all know that Duchenne has been cured probably about a dozen times in the MDX mouse. And then when those therapies move forward to higher mammals or to people, sometimes it doesn't seem as promising. Other animals that can provide us with a better sense are the dog model of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and then non-human primates as well. What side effects have been seen in the animals? And that's really important to understand and tease out. Because with anything in life, it doesn't matter what we're talking about, there's always potential risks. And we need to understand what those risks are, particularly, as we'll see, for phase 1 studies, which are the first in human studies. So the preclinical work is the next step. That's the one that are done in animals, moving up to higher animal models, really aimed at looking at safety, side effects, and efficacy in those animal models to see if they offer benefit. So when we put the gene inside this viral vector and we give it to a mouse with DMD or to a golden retriever that has DMD, does it help them? Are they stronger? And then we move into the clinical trials. And you'll hear about this phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And it is important to understand the differences between them. Clinical trials, the one thing that they have in common is they all involve human beings. The research that was done before that is the preclinical studies. But clinical trials involve humans, and they compare the intervention of a drug, a gene therapy, a device between groups, either to a natural history group or potentially a placebo group, depending on the different phases that things are at. And they move forward in time. So an intervention is given, and then we observe to see the benefit that results from that. And all of the phases 1 through 3, they all must have regulatory approval in the jurisdiction where they're being run. So in Canada, they all must be approved by Health Canada before we're allowed to run them. They have to be carried out at an institution where there's qualified investigators and a qualified team to be able to run that trial. And then they require Research Ethics Board approval before it's allowed to be run. The phase 1 studies are the first in human studies. They're typically done on a much smaller number of people. In many cases, it'll be a population of healthy human volunteers first. But in some cases, like gene therapy, for example, it'll be done on a very small number of people who have DMD. And some of the goals in this is to really assess safety. It's sometimes to try to determine what the safe or the most effective dosing range is, and to see how the body reacts and breaks down the study medication that's being given. So one of the benefits, I would say, of being part of the first in human studies is that often these studies are run as an open label study where there's no placebo group. So everybody typically will get access to the medication. But one of the downsides to it is, if you want to think of it that way, is it is a first in human study. So there's less experience with that medication having been administered to people, and in this instance, people with DMD. Phase 2 studies are the early efficacy phase, where it's given to a larger number of people. We're still looking at safety, but we're starting to look at more efficacy or effectiveness of the drug. Is it making people stronger? Is it having a benefit on the heart and the lungs? And then the phase 3 is traditionally given to a much larger number of people. And the goal of that is really looking at efficacy. Is this drug effective, and is it making a difference? And there's typically a placebo group in that phase 3 study. Phase 4 is after there's been approval, and then there's still ongoing larger population studies that are being done. We don't tend to see this in rare diseases, but it is done for other conditions like antihypertensive and things that are used at larger population levels. And in rare diseases, you'll sometimes see these combined. So the phase 1 and phase 2 will be wrapped together, and then the phase 2 and 3 will be wrapped together as well. It's important that clinical trials can give people access to drugs, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why that I really favor bringing these therapies to the young man that I care for in my clinic. But it can't be automatically considered immediate access to therapy. It's not. There's other things that may get in the way of that. So the screening visit, a person may not qualify for it. There may be placebo groups where there's a long period of time potentially before an individual might get access to the drug. So that has to be understood. And it may be perfectly acceptable to people, but it just needs to be understood ahead of time. Other questions we need to ask ourselves is there a financial cost to participating? Now, there should not be a direct financial cost to being part of a clinical trial. So the travel to the site, the hotel stay, meals, those are things that are typically covered by the sponsor that's running the trial. But there still are other costs. There's lost work. How might it affect a parent or a caregiver's job that's taking an individual frequently to clinical trial visits, missing school, and the impact that has, disrupting life. And also just what else are we dealing with in life? Is this a good time to actually consider being part of a clinical trial? It might be if it's something that is very promising and if people have been wanting to be part of this trial for a while, but it may not be if there's other things going on, like another family member that's unwell, for example. And then are we planning on traveling anywhere? Because as you'll see with the clinical trials, there's sometimes very, very close follow-up that's required. And for safety reasons, it's necessary to be present for those follow-up visits. So it's not a time where someone can say, hey, I'm taking off for 2 months and I'm going to go to wherever and visit extended family members. You can't do that when there's a clinical trial. It's not safe, and it's also important for the integrity of the study for an individual to be present for all of the visits, or they have to exit the trial. Another piece that's really important leading up to a clinical trial, even before you speak to the individual that's running it, is unless it's essential for medical reasons, I'd really strongly encourage you to avoid changing your regular medical treatments, your regular medication regimes, because sometimes changing the dose of steroids, introducing or change the dose of a cardiac med like lisinopril or enalapril, starting testosterone, for example, can sometimes make an individual ineligible for a clinical trial. So if it's an emergency, of course, but if it's not an emergency, ask if that might be a problem in the trial before you make that change. The same thing, are any of the supplements that you're on problematic? Certainly it's not a good time to start any new supplement that you've maybe read about online, because again, that might be a problem for the trial. Check first. And then some investigational or non-approved medications may be an obstacle to participation. So an example of that can be there's a large number of young men that are on vamorolone, because Canada's played a very pivotal part in the clinical trials with vamorolone. But for some of the other investigational studies right now, the other clinical trials, because vamorolone right now is not Health Canada approved, it's considered an investigational product in Canada. So it could potentially be an obstacle to being part of some clinical trials. Now, hopefully that will change if vamorolene's approved. It'll no longer be an investigational product. It'll be standard of care like it is in the US. But right now, it could impact, and that's just an example, participation in some clinical trials. When considering the trial design, it's really important that you talk to the person that's running it and understand, is it an open label study or is it a placebo control study? And the difference with that is, in an open label study, which is typically earlier on in phase 1 or phase 2, everybody gets access to the medication. But in a placebo control trial, there will be a proportion of the individuals that are part of that study that will get a treatment that is it's a nothing treatment. It looks just like or feels just like the investigational product, the drug, but it's not the investigational product. And the person that's part of the trial, their family, the principal investigator at the site will have no idea if that individual is on the investigational product, the drug, or placebo. It's not the decision that the investigator makes. It's done randomly through a computer assignment program to try to ensure that the integrity of the trial from a statistical standpoint is upheld. Now, there are some people that would accept being into a placebo and say, you know what, I'm okay with that. Because I believe that this research is very important for the larger DMD community, because I would potentially I will have access to the drug after the trial is over. There's other people that say, no, I'm not interested in that. I don't want to take that chance. But it's important to understand that trial design. If there is a placebo group, it's important to understand how people are randomized. So is it a 50-50 chance you'll get drug versus placebo? Is it 2-to-1 randomization? So there's a 2/3 chance you'll get the drug and a 1/3 chance you'll get placebo, or a 3-to-1, which would be 75% risk of getting the drug versus 25% placebo. So understanding that likelihood of being randomized to one or other group may be important for some people. Also related to if there's a placebo, but just in general, willingness or desire to participate in the trial is how long is it running for? There's a huge range in terms of how long trials will run for. Some can be as short as a few months. Some can go on for 18 months or longer. And it really depends on what the sponsor of the trial is looking for, and they've worked this out with experts and their statisticians to try to estimate how long the trial needs to run for them to see the potential difference that they're hoping that that drug will provide. But that's important to ask that. It's important to ask about and understand what inclusion and exclusion criteria mean. So, just because there's a study that's being run for people with DMD doesn't necessarily mean that an individual may be able to be part of it. All studies will be required to have a very strict list of criteria that could make a person eligible or ineligible. So, for example, it might be the case for a trial that it only will allow patients between the age of 4 and 8 years of age, or 8 years of age to 25 years of age. So there's different age groups that can be part of it. Some of them, there's very specific mutations. Sometimes being on some medications can make someone ineligible. It can be an exclusion criteria. And again, those are not things that are set by the doctor that's running the trial. They're set by the company, approved by Health Canada, and they can't be negotiated or changed. So it's just important to understand what they are. To ask if you'll have access to the drug after the end of the trial. So this is usually the case, but it's important to clarify that. Is there an extension phase? Is there an exceptional access program or compassionate release for the drug? If I participate in the trial, so I can still get it after the trial's over. And how intensive is the follow-up? So how often do I need to come back? Is it every week? Is it once a month? Is it every 3 months? And you have to factor that in based on how far are you traveling to the site. If it's in your city, it may be less of an issue. If you're having to fly, for example, to somewhere in the United States, then it might be a much bigger issue if you have to travel frequently for that. What invasive procedures are required? So with many trials, it is necessary to have muscle biopsies done. Some of them may involve spinal taps. Some of them may involve X-rays or DEXA scans that have low levels of radiation, but just ask questions like that. What invasive procedures are required for the trial? And putting all those things together will help you to understand and decide whether that trial is right for you or for your family member. It's important to ask yourself, what alternatives do you have? So are there any standard of care treatments that might be available as an alternative? What other clinical trials are expected to be coming? This is a really important one, because for many of these trials, if someone participates in a trial and then they decide they want to be in a different one, many times the participation in the initial trial will make that individual ineligible for the next trial. So you have to be very cautious about that. You don't want to wait too long, of course. You want to be able to access a trial and access a therapy that looks very promising, but you need to put that in the context of what else is coming. And there's a lot that's coming. And one of the things that I would say is it's frustrating as hell in Canada right now because we don't have access to therapies. We don't have anything approved other than prednisone, which is really unacceptable. But the one silver lining in that is when I looked south of the border where they have access to vamorolone, they have access to givinostat, they have access to 4 different antisense oligonucleotides, they have access to gene replacement therapy, and we don't. The sponsors are looking to countries like Canada to run these next stages of trials because it's harder for them to run these trials in the United States where these therapies are approved. So we will be seeing more trials, and we are seeing more trials in Canada, in part as a consequence of that. Dr. Yaworski's already shown you this, and I'm not going to go into any details except to say these different trials target different problems or different parts of the the DMD cascade, for lack of a better word. So they're either working at the DNA level by replacing a microdystrophin. They're working at altering the splicing of the RNA, which is like the photocopies of the DNA. Or they're actually working on the protein itself to try to make that protein more effective. And then we heard another example of a small molecule that Stellos is bringing to clinical trials. That's a small molecule taken orally that's going to be affecting the division of satellite cells. So that's a little bit different again. Now, Health Canada's Special Access Program, I think many of you are familiar with this. If you are on deflazacort or if you have a family member on deflazacort, it is an effective way to potentially bring a therapy into the country if it's approved in another jurisdiction. So what happens with the Health Canada Special Access Program is if I have a discussion with the person I'm caring for and they say, I really want to have access to deflazacort or whatever, I'd like you to ask the government to allow me to be able to bring that into Canada. I can fill out paperwork and put together an application as to why I feel this is important. And the government will review it and say yes or no. Now, it works for drugs that are not too expensive because for most people who are on deflazacort, you'll know that it's not reimbursable. You have to pay out of pocket for it. And the reason for that is if it's not approved in Canada and we bring that into Canada, it doesn't have a drug identification number because it's not Health Canada approved. And as a consequence of that, the provincial governments will not reimburse for it. Private insurance will not reimburse for it. So people that are on deflazacort are paying hundreds of dollars a year to be able to access that. So looking ahead to gene replacement therapy that's produced by Sarepta in the United States, delastrogene moxeparvovec, I could theoretically fill out an application and ask for Health Canada to allow me to bring that in to dose a specific patient. But the problem with that is it's incredibly expensive. It's millions of dollars. And because it's not approved by Health Canada and it's not reimbursable, it's just beyond the reality of pretty much anybody that I've ever known. Nobody has pocket change like that they can spend on a medication. So it's not a program that is in any way helpful or effective for novel therapies, emerging therapies, because of the cost that's associated with them. The Health Candidates Review is the next step after clinical trials have been completed. And in order for that to happen, a sponsor has to file a new drug submission to Health Canada. So it's a sponsor-initiated step. Then Health Canada reviews the documents that are submitted to them, and they make a decision as to whether they will issue an NOC or a notice of compliance to allow that drug to be marketed in Canada. And there is an accelerated review where it takes about 6 to 8 months for Health Canada to review it, and that has happened before for other neuromuscular conditions like SMA. But in general, the standard review, the review time is 1 to 2 years. Very frustrating when we're waiting for access to a therapy and it's taking so long for it to go through that process. Now, there was questions about this before. I think it was Maureen had asked about this before. Like, why is it so much faster in the United States? And the reason for that is because of their accelerated approval program. So the United States have a special pathway, you might call it, when there's an unmet medical need for a very severe or serious medical condition, where they will allow for earlier approval of that drug. And they will accept a surrogate endpoint. So I used CK as an example, but it could be many other biochemical examples, neurofilament, for example, in conditions where nerves are dying off. And if you show a change in that biochemical marker, then, and you can argue that that is potentially an indicator of what's happening with the disease itself, then the FDA will allow for conditional approval with that. And then the company goes back afterwards, submits additional information when it becomes available, and then they will make a decision ultimately about whether they give permanent approval. That's what allowed for the gene therapy in the United States to be approved so quickly in that 4 to 5-year-old range. And then they extended it based upon the data that came out from the EMBARK study. Unfortunately, in Europe and in Canada, we don't have anything equivalent to that. So they have to go through the full review as the initial review, where they review clinically meaningful, clinically significant, quote unquote, data before making a decision about approval or not. And then even after the Health Canada approval has happened, there's a need for review by the Canadian Drug Agency in Canada, or INES in Quebec, for them to decide if the evidence is sufficient for the public payer to reimburse. Now, you could still get access if you have private insurance while you're waiting for this to take place. But if you don't have that, if you don't have a good benefits program through your employer or that you're paying for privately, then you would have to wait until this review has been done and for the province to decide based on their recommendations for whom they will cover the cost of the drug. And sometimes it can get narrowed even further. So for SMA, Health Canada gave very broad approval for gene replacement therapy. It was approved for anybody with 2 or 3 SMN2 copies, regardless of age, regardless of weight. But then when the CDA in INES did their review, the CDA in particular really narrowed down the group that they recommended reimbursement for, and it required a lot of fighting, negotiations, maybe a better word, between us and the provinces to be able to kind of push back on that and expand a little bit more. This also takes time. So for omnisemnogene abeparvovec for SMA, CDA published their recommendations 9 months after Health Canada approval. And for nusinersen, which is an RNA splicing modulator, it was more than a year later for them to publish their recommendations. I've talked about the private insurance and now the registries. So in Canada, we're very lucky that we have a very effective registry that's called the CNDR, the Canadian Neuromuscular Disease Registry. And some of you may have heard of it, and others maybe not. I can tell you that it's a cross-Canada initiative, that it's been active since 2010. There's several index diseases, meaning priority diseases or conditions, for which DMD is one of them. And all of the various pediatric and adult hospitals that look after people who have DMD are active and are able to enroll people in the registry. Now, initially, when the registry was first created in Canada, the goal was clinical trial readiness. So what it was really about is you can imagine if a company that's used to working in the United States starts thinking about potentially doing clinical trials in other countries, if they kind of look to Canada, they might be like, well, how many people are there with DMD in Canada? I don't really know a lot about Canada. We would be able to point them to the CNDR. They could look at that database and they would be able to say, well, you know, we have this many hundreds of people across the country who have DMD. You know, these are the mutations of the individuals who are on DMD. So it is worth bringing that antisense oligonucleotide or exon skipping therapy to clinical trial in Canada and running it here. So it was a way of us demonstrating that we had the population that could benefit from Canada being part of a clinical trial, and in specific, where it's mutation specific, that we were able to have even patients with more specific gene mutations that might benefit from the clinical trial to encourage companies to come. It's been quite effective for that. The other part where the registries are really, really important is for something called post-marketing surveillance. And there's several reasons why that's critically important. So number one is when an individual has been given a medication, there's a need for us to have a better understand in the very long term, is that medication effective? And are there any side effects that have come up that potentially could be attributable to that medication? So let's say, for example, you know, still a relatively new therapy, a gene replacement therapy, and a child's treated with that. Or 5 years down the road, there's something very rare that happens, a very rare side effect, and people are scratching their head and being like, is this related to the gene therapy, or is this something that maybe just because, you know, we all will have other medical conditions that happen that are completely unrelated. So if we're able to capture that in the registry, and then there's a second person that has it, or maybe a third person that has it, it becomes much more compelling that it's potentially related to that. And then we can inform other Canadians of this potential adverse event that may take many years for it to emerge. So it's really critical for that, and critical for us to understand if the therapy is effective long-term. It's also really critical in the situation where we're talking about add-on therapies. So many of the different treatments that we're talking about in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, so we'll talk about vamorolone, we'll talk about givinostat, and we talk about ASOs or gene replacement therapies. In a perfect world, we would be able to offer you a couple different medications that potentially could have an additive benefit and potentially have a synergistic effect and offer even better muscle strength. The way we're going to capture that information is through registries. And I'll tell you, if we look at spinal muscular atrophy, it's been a challenge. So spinal muscular atrophy is a wonderful success story that went from a horrible, rapidly progressive condition to having 3 very effective therapies that are now here for patients. And in the United States, it's not unusual for an individual who has SMA and has insurance to be treated with a therapy like gene replacement therapy initially, and then have risdiplam added on or Spinraza added on afterwards. In Canada, that's not our reality. In all of the provinces in Canada, if an individual is treated with gene replacement therapy, the provinces will say, no, there's no evidence of there being any benefit to adding on a second agent. We're not going to pay for a second agent. That's it. And I'll tell you, the people that I care for, their families get very frustrated about that because they're on Facebook groups and they're hearing about friends and other family members in the US that are getting access to 2 therapies and are telling stories about how they're doing better as a result of that. So these registries are really important because if we were able to, and we are doing this for SMA, if we're able to have that post-marketing surveillance, we may be able to answer the question about, well, now that we add on risdiplam as an example or nusinersen, that we're seeing improvements or we're not seeing improvements. So we're able to tell that story more accurately, because that's not something that companies are likely to study. And I hope we don't end up in a situation where the government says, well, you can choose between vamorolone or givinostat or an antisense oligonucleotide or a gene replacement therapy. We don't want to end up in that situation. So the registry is really important to answer that question. Registries are anonymous. If people sign the consent form to be part of it, because you have to consent to be part of it, then what happens is that just very key information will be reported from the center where you receive your care into the database, like mutation, some very key motor outcomes. That's usually North Star Ambulatory Assessment, just a few key outcomes that's put into the database and is available in aggregate form. So it says nothing about an individual's name, where they live, nothing like that. It's all anonymous. And I would really encourage you to talk to the doctors that care for you, for those that are outside of Ottawa. And even if you're here in Ottawa and haven't heard of it, talk to us about it, because I would strongly encourage that you consider consenting to be part of this, both for the larger community as well as yourselves. Sponsors will sometimes use this, and I would say the registry is also very effective if someone is from a city where there's less clinical trial presence or less clinical trial participation. What they can do sometimes is company A might say, CNDR, we would be grateful if you could send a letter out on your database. We don't need to know who any of these people are, but just send a letter out on your database to anybody who has an exon deletion that's potentially amenable to exon 45 skipping. And then CNDR, if the board agrees, would send a letter out to the family saying, there is a research opportunity that's beginning in Canada in the following sites that's looking at exon 45 skipping. If you're interested in learning more, these are the people that you can contact. And when you get that letter, you could be like, yeah, I want to know more about this. I'm going to call this Dr. Campbell guy in London, or I'm going to call this Dr. McAdam woman at Bloorview and find out more about this. Or you might be like, nah, not really interested right now, too much going on, and then just shred it. But at least it gives you a way of finding out about this, so that if you don't have a visit for a while with your doctor, or if you are in a center where your doctor doesn't do any clinical trials, you might not hear about it otherwise. Treat NMD is a national database, and the Canadian group contributes to that. So on the upper left are the Treat NMD members that are collecting very basic information about DMD treatments. There's recipients that receive newsletters. So this is predominantly families and patients, but also potentially doctors on the upper right that receive their newsletters. People that are accessing their web links on the bottom left. And then various NMD care and trial sites in the bottom right. So Canada is very much a part of all of those. So I'm going to stop there. I do have, I'm not sure if we have time for questions. I shouldn't just assume that, but I am happy to answer questions if there is time. And if there's not, I'm happy for you to send me an email and I'll do my best to reply. Thank you very much.
Uh, Thank you for that great talk. So out of the registry, do you all have a natural history study for DMD?
The registry's been running for some time, so there certainly is natural history data that can be extracted from that, and we have used the registry data for other means. So on behalf of all of the just an examples, but on behalf of all of the neuromuscular specialists in Canada, I recently wrote a letter to the editor advocating that we need to extend coverage in SMA of disease-modifying therapies to patients who have 4 copies of SMN2. So that may not mean a lot to people in this room, but it's a group of people who have SMA that have been excluded from receiving therapies because they weren't seen as a priority group or being severe enough. So we were able to go back to the registry. We were able to look at it and say, well, for people who have 4 copies of SMN2, what age did they start to show symptoms? And they show symptoms at, on average 2.5 years old, which is pretty young. And what percentage show symptoms in childhood? What percentage lose the ability to walk? So we can extract Canadian data and then use that when we are then challenging provinces to say, look, it's unacceptable that you've limited this to just individuals with 2 and 3 copies. You need to also include patients with 4 copies like Quebec does. The rest of the country doesn't. So now we could do the same for DMD. So we have all that data. We've got data about when diagnoses were made, delays to diagnoses. We've got data pertaining to functional abilities and ambulation, pulmonary function tests. A lot of that basic stuff is there. The database is being revised, and there's a group of experts that's meeting later in October or early November. The date's not finalized yet, to look at that post-marketing surveillance piece. So what do we need to start adding to the database in this new world that we're living in, where there are now emerging therapies to capture what people are on, what sort of potential AEs or SAEs, so side effects, might we be seeing in the longer term? So that's that forward-looking piece about therapies people are on and potential side effects being captured is not currently part of the registry, but will become part of the registry in time. And that, hopefully that answered your question. It's really key to have that data, though. The payers and the provinces really like to see things that are published, and they like to see that data. And you know, I was thinking when Terrence was speaking and how impactful that was about the impact on caregivers, and you know, that's the sort of thing where if that can be captured as a survey or as a report and then published, that's very impactful for as a community to take that back to the provinces and say, look at the stresses that our caregivers are undergoing. Look at the challenges that they're facing, you know, based on these accepted scales. And this is why we need additional supports, because, you know, it's as a single voice, sometimes they won't listen to us. Often they won't listen to us. But as a unified voice where we tell our story and then that story goes out there into the world, then that can no longer be overlooked. It becomes much more powerful. It becomes much more impactful when everyone's saying the same thing and shouting out where there's inequities and there's lack of services. It's really critical. I'd bring you the microphone, but I'm afraid I'm going to cause interference. I'm not sure exactly how it works.
I do have a question. You mentioned that you guys look a lot to the south of the border to new clinical trials and everything that it's in the edge. Um, if a parent does the muscle work and find a clinical trial, say in the US or in Europe, uh, do physicians in Canada are able to do the bridge so they can participate on those trials if it's possible or
Absolutely.
okay.
So I would say that there are a number of patients across the country that I know of that have gone down to the US to be part of a clinical trial. I have patients myself. So when I first started in Ottawa in 2010, I trained in Boston. And when I came and started working at CHEO in 2010, I remember just feeling frustrated because there were clinical trials that were being run for SMA at that point in time. And I remember referring patients down to Boston to be part of these clinical trials. And that's still the case. There's still situations, even with gene therapy, where people have gone south of the border. But I remember thinking to myself, this is nonsense. Like, I shouldn't have to be sending people to the United States. We need to be running these trials in Canada. So a group of us, and Craig Campbell was a real leader in this, started to try to interact more with sponsors, emphasize that that Canadian centers follow standard of care and have access to all of the measuring that's necessary to be part of a clinical trial. So we've been running more and more here. But to your point, absolutely, you can travel out of province to another site. You can travel to the US as a site. Europe might be harder just because it's a long flight, but it's not impossible. It does depend on how intensive the follow-up is. So for the gene therapies, for example, if an individual were to travel down to the United States to be part of a gene therapy trial, essentially you'd be looking at about a 2 to 3 month commitment to stay there. So that would not be a trial where someone could be flying back and forth. It would be necessary to stay there for that period of time, which would be very difficult for many people to do, but possible for some. Fortunately, I think that is changing. There still are some trials that are only being run in the United States or have, for whatever reason, chosen to not include Canadian sites as part of their trial design. And I'm not going to call anybody out. But I would say for the majority of trials, there are centers in Canada that are part of it. We also try to be very collaborative in Canada. So if I know that Toronto is going to be a site for a study or Montreal is going to be a site, and we only have, let's say, one patient with a deletion that's amenable to exon skipping with a specific therapy, for me, it would make more sense, although I know it's an inconvenience for the family, if Toronto has many more patients, that they be active and then our patient travel there. And then we do the alternate in other situations where we run studies that are not being run at other centers, and then people will come from other cities to Ottawa to run. So we recognize, for us as clinicians, it's a lot of work to put these trials forward. We have wonderful research teams that help us, but we don't all have to run all the trials. We try to share them so that that we can all kind of share the work. But yes, it is possible to travel. And you can find out about these trials from organizations like Defeat Duchenne. You can find out about them through PPMD and others. Your doctors should know. And then clinicaltrials.gov is a really, really good way that you can find out on your own of trials that are ongoing.
This is so I'm Elena. I work at PepGen, and I sort of have the opposite question that you do sort of for Canada, which is I'm sure many other sponsors here in the room get this, but I get emails from all over the world. You know, I live in India and my two brothers have Duchenne, and what are our options? And I know it is, in my experience, I can't speak for Canada, but at least in the US, it's a very site by site sort of policy along with the sponsor if they will accept patients that are international referrals. How does that work in Canada and, you know, for potentially receiving patients at Canadian sites who don't live in Canada?
Yeah, I agree. It's very site by site. And it's also in part, I would say, even specific study to specific study. We have had Americans in our trials previously, but one of the challenges that we have to face, because we have to think of all potential scenarios, is heaven forbid anything ever went wrong. Heaven forbid there was ever a lawsuit. If an American is participating in a trial in Ottawa, I open myself up to some potential medical legal risk if they sue me in the state of Pennsylvania or they sue me in the state of Florida, and then I have to travel down to Florida to defend myself. So one of the requirements that we have at our institution, I know this is probably not relevant to most people, so I'll keep it very brief, is we do ask the family, if they're from the United States, to sign, I'm not sure what the word is, like a contract or an agreement that that anybody can always choose to sue a sponsor and sue a doctor. That's always somebody's right. That's not waived through clinical trial participation. But if they choose to do that, that they agree to do so in a Canadian court. But that's the specific issue, mostly for Americans, to be honest. The challenge for other countries tends to be a little bit more about visa, travel, what's the standard of care like in the country where they come from. So there's a number of different considerations. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but I would say our priority is definitely providing the trials for Canadians, for people that are here. And we would consider anything beyond that in a very case-by-case example. Hopefully nobody sues.
A question around how we improve reimbursement in Canada. So with all of these treatment options on the horizon, that hope is only realized if it's really available to everyone. Yeah. Anything that the sponsors or the community can be doing or thinking about to condense the time between drug approval and reimbursement approval?
Yeah, I think there's you know, and this kind of goes back again to some of the conversation that Eric and Terrence and Torrance had, is the government, and particularly the provinces, they're very interested in how effective the drug is, how much does the drug cost in the United States, but they also want to know about the burden of illness. They want to know how much does this illness cost society? How much is it costing the people that are living with this illness, both in terms of stressors, burnout, like extra purchases? Because I don't need to tell anybody in this room, it's expensive living with a chronic disease. It's very expensive. There's a lot of extra costs that people have to pay out of pocket that an individual who doesn't have a chronic disease is very fortunate to not have to spend. So they also want to know all of that. So what I would say is many times companies can be very focused on the US list price and the scientific data showing how effective a drug is. But I would say that there also needs to be a greater attention placed upon on the burden that it's having, and how that may be remedied by potentially introducing a specific therapy. And I would say that was very important for SMA. I think there's a lot that we in the DMD community can learn from the SMA community. And I think they did it right with their natural history studies, their registry data, their burden of health collection. And they were able to get these things through fast. Like when you look at those timelines, I know they seem long when you're saying that it took an extra 6 months for CADTH, it's now CDA, to do their review. That's like lightning fast compared to what we're used to with other things. So I do think we can learn from them, and that's an area that needs attention. Right. I think the online people have probably moved on. There's still, that's good. That's good. Excellent. Well, thank you all for your attention. And I really am grateful to have an opportunity to speak to you all. Thank you.